Good evening. I'm very happy to be here tonight to share a return to school update for this Board of Education meeting, February 16th, 2021. Our agenda for this presentation is a bit of context, where we've been and where we are now, as well as a bit of forward-looking to proposals for grade 3 and self-contained middle school special education programs and what will come after that. Our vision from the beginning was to safely return all students and staff members to the Warren Township schools. As a community, we should all be extremely proud of our success in doing so since the very first day of school back on September 8th. It's one of the few school districts in the state of New Jersey to open and stay open 5 days per week, right at the very beginning of the school year. At that time, we announced guiding principles, which we've reiterated each time we've made adjustments to our return to school plan, that we will prioritize the health and safety of our students and our staff members above all else, that we will follow Department of Education guidance, including physical distancing, discouraging cohort mixing, encouraging and improving hygiene practices, and taking into consideration the impact on the mental health and wellness of our students, our staff, and the wider school community. And finally, that we will rely on the most up-to-date scientific data and professional recommendations available while trying to be both flexible and predictable to families and staff members. As we all know, these plans require us to respond to updated guidance from various entities, and we continually adjust them based on directives of our local health official, state health officials, the New Jersey Department of Education, and also the CDC. As I'm sure most of you know, last Friday afternoon, the CDC issued new guidelines. Those guidelines reiterated the expectations our plan is built on, saying that we should keep people 6 feet apart at a minimum if they're not from the same household in both indoor and outdoor spaces, and that cohorting and podding is recommended to minimize exposure across the school environment. The document goes on to emphasize that that is even more important and essential at the middle school and high school levels than the elementary levels. We're very proud that on the flexibility side, we have been able to meet 100% of the requests that have come to us, all 114 of them since the beginning of the school year, where a parent asked for their child to move from in-person to distance or vice versa, in some cases both. That is something that we've been able to offer our community that is not offered in most other communities. Not only do we have schools open and operating 5 days a week, but we are flexible to meet the needs of families as those needs change. Thought it might be helpful for people to understand a little bit about the process we follow on a weekly basis, as we are constantly iterating our return to school plan. Each Tuesday, I meet with our return to school subcommittee chairs. These are district leaders in the areas that you can see on the screen here. We talk about the coming week, what our priorities are for that week, work that's going on in our subcommittees, anything new that comes from the state or federal governments, and how we're going to respond to that information. Then over the course of the week on Wednesdays for the district, but on various days by building, we convene stakeholder groups, district and school return to school committees that have a wider representation of other kinds of employee groups. And those groups are responsible as well for designing and for analyzing the stakeholder surveys we do each month. Every Wednesday morning, the entire leadership team, all school and district administrators, meet together to work on these topics as well. And then the Wednesday prior to each Board of Education meeting, the board's return to school committee meets. That's a combination of 4 board members and 4 district leaders to talk about what's coming for the board agenda and make sure that we're all on the same page about what our goals are and objectives are. That's a place for two-way dialogue between the board representing the community and the administration who follows through on policies for the board. And then finally, we come to a board meeting like this where the Board of Education takes action on the recommendations, hears updates, and then the cycle begins anew with new guidance. We know that there's a relationship between cases that are taking place in our immediate community and our surroundings and what happens in the school district. To put a number to this, we ran a correlation coefficient statistical model that depicts the strength between 2 different sets of data. In this case, the data of school-based cases, meaning students or employees who come to school and have a case of COVID-19, and cases in our region on the State Department of Health documentation. The scores come back between -1 and 1 on the correlation coefficient. A score of 1 means that there is a perfect positive relationship. That is, as cases go up in the community, they go up in the schools. A -1 means as cases go down in the community, then they would go up in the schools. So there'd be an inverse relationship. And a 0 means there's no statistical relationship. The current data as of last week's data is a relationship of 0.70, which is considered a strong positive correlation. That is, as cases go up around us, cases that impact the school district go up. This may seem like common sense, but it's really important because it helps emphasize the significance of our community transmission rate and why that matters to our school operations. As you can see on this slide, the community transmission rate according to the Department of Health for our region, which includes Hunterdon, Somerset, and Mercer counties, every 3-county group in the state was broken down into a region. We're in Central Jersey West for how the state publishes its data. When we reopened schools back on September 8th, our case rate was quite low, in the moderate range at 2 cases per 100,000. And it stayed that way all the way through this green in the fall, even as we got into yellow, and then it jumped up into the very high risk level in November and stayed there throughout the entire winter, and only for the last 2 weeks has started to come down. In other words, we've been operating with our schools in the orange zone on the state system, but the case rate at the red zone, at the very high risk, relatively safely. But as those cases went up in the community, they also went up among our students and our staff. As you can see here, at the end of April, there were 106 cases in Warren Township. This is not the school, but in the community as a whole. And all the way through the spring and the summer, those cases stayed relatively small in their growth. And then they started jumping in November, December, January, just like in our entire region. And halfway through February, we still see another 57 cases this month, halfway through. If we continue on that trend, it'll be another big uptick into the 700s here in the month of February. Even while the cases in Warren Township and the wider community were going up, we were continuing to make progress on our K-8 reopening progression. So last spring, we implemented full facility closure across the state. Warren Township was one of the few districts that reopened completely back in September with schools open 5 days a week. And our students in our hybrid 1.0 model, on the very first day of school, we immediately convened our committees to start working on what would come next. As long as our safety data and our protocols worked, what would come next? A month later, we implemented K2 students coming to school 5 days per week, should their parents suggest it, or select it, excuse me, while our 3 through 8 students continued in the hybrid. And then in November, we were able to bring back our upper elementary school self-contained special education program students with a plan to then follow with grade 3 and middle school special education. Those plans were put on hold when the state data went to very high risk, and we kind of put a pause in the fall. Just last week, we moved back into yellow or moderate, which is why we're here suggesting and proposing to bring 3rd grade and middle school special education self-contained programs back in just 2 weeks on March 1st, and then we'll follow up with grades 4 and 5. In order to bring 4 and 5 back, though, there are 3 things that need to happen. 1, we need the risk level in our region to maintain at the yellow or better, moderate. We need to know what our 4th and 5th grade parents want. So there had been some communications from parents saying that they would actually prefer to stay in the hybrid and not be in 5 days a week because of risk concerns. So we have to be careful that we don't overcorrect, and we need to find out exactly what all of our 4th and 5th grade parents think. And we know that we are hitting the max on many of our buses for the number of students assigned seats. And so we need to know if more parents are willing across the elementary grades to waive their seats on the bus, which will allow us to bring more 4th and 5th grade students in for 5 days a week. Just to see that same data of the cases in our region on the same timeline, Hybrid 1.0 was implemented at the beginning of the school year while we were in green. Hybrid 1.1 was implemented while we were still in green. Hybrid 1.2 was proposed, but it wasn't implemented until we had just started hitting the orange, and then we paused until we're now back into yellow and the moderate risk. Another bit of data that might be helpful as people talk about what's going on in other school districts. There are 16 school districts in Somerset County that have elementary schools. 14 of them replied to a recent survey about the percentage of students they have attending in school versus the percentage of students in full distance. And the reason this goes through 4th grade is that many school districts in Somerset County define elementary school as K4, and then their 5th graders go to middle school or intermediate. So for an apples to apples comparison, we need to stop at grade 4. You can see that there's a low of 30% of students in person to a high of 84%, with the mean somewhere in the 55 or so range when you bring them all together. Warren Township elementary schools have the highest percentage of students in person at 84%. You can see most, one school district is near us, but everybody else is pretty far behind. So we're very proud. This is a wonderful thing to celebrate, but it also brings with it restrictions because our classrooms are already operating at about as full as they can be in terms of 6-foot physical distancing. Some other points of reflection. Although it's easy to point at a list of cases and say it's relatively small with 50-something cases tied to the school district, we need to remember that each one of those cases represents a real person, a student or a staff member in our community who is dealing with COVID-19. While we've been fortunate that those cases have mostly been moderate, they haven't all been moderate. And I had an opportunity to talk to a parent of students who tested positive just last week, who shared feeling shunned and stigmatized by their neighbors and their children's friends, which is a problem that we all need to grapple with. And for each case that's reported to us, we know that there are many other cases adjacent to our students and our employees, people who have lost relatives or have friends and family in the hospital or otherwise suffering, or who have been exposed, and that brings stress to the job as well. Yet our staff come to work every day, they put on smiles behind their masks, and they provide a safe, nurturing environment for our students while dealing with these challenging circumstances at home and at school. Last spring and summer, I talked a lot about empathy, and we have to recognize that although we might be in school on the schedule we are, many of our teachers live in communities where the schools are not open like they are here, and so they're dealing with their own challenges with childcare while coming to work to do their job for the students of Warren Township every day. And finally, we can't take for granted the enormous efforts it takes to keep the doors open. So things run so smoothly that I think sometimes we forget about how much work goes in to managing the health screenings and health and safety protocols and the quarantining and responding to questions about travel and everything else, not to mention the daily instruction that happens in our classrooms. We are collecting more data in the 2020-21 school year than we ever have before about students' academic progress. And this will help us drive support for students who, if they're struggling or have unfinished learning now while school's in session, in the summer during our academic support programs and summer fun, and into the future. All students across the world are dealing with COVID and are learning in a COVID environment. We know that many students in our immediate area and throughout the country are not in schools at the levels that our students are. All of these kids, whether they're at home, in school, or in a combination of the two, are learning essential life skills above and beyond what they might otherwise learn in the areas of persistence and grit and determination and resiliency, and those things are very valuable as well. Our 4 middle schools that feed into Watchung Hills are in close contact with each other and with the high school to make sure there's a smooth transition for our graduating 8th graders. More to come on that as well. And we know that a consistent experience is really, really important. And so we don't recommend changes to our in-person learning time until we are confident we can do so and not have to backslide on it. You might have seen in some other communities as they've announced more aggressive reopening plans, they say right in those communications that they might have to go back if too many people say yes to the option. We are presenting proposals that we know we can maintain, even if every single parent says yes to it. And finally, every community is different. There are different realities and different limiters. I'm going to highlight a few of those here. The main categories of limitations on how we plan for return to school come from the guidelines from the state and federal governments. Classroom capacity limits speak to the 6-foot physical distancing. By having a limit, in our case, it's about 14 kids in most of our classrooms. By having a limit of about 14, that means we need more classes, which means we need more teachers. So we've pulled basic skills teachers, gifted and talented teachers to be homeroom teachers this year at the elementary schools. At the middle school, this is really difficult to achieve because middle school teachers are required to have subject area certifications. And so you can't just create another classroom with one teacher. You really need an entire new team, which is very difficult to do. There's not a supply of teachers out there waiting for jobs in this environment. We have bus capacity limits, which I've talked about a bit already. Under the guidelines that we have in place, there's 1 family per bench, and that limits us to a little bit more than 50% bus capacity. And then under different risk levels, we have different restrictions. So yellow reduces some of those restrictions, which makes it easier for us to get people back out of a quarantine. And when we think about all these different limitations, any decisions we make have an implication for the future. So every time we pull a staff member out of basic skills to teach a homeroom so we can bring another grade level back, that's a class of basic skills we can't teach. In order to bring 4th and 5th grade back, we know that we're going to have to move some classrooms into large group spaces like music rooms and art rooms. By doing that, that means those spaces are not available to teach music and art, which limits our ability to bring back full days of school in the future. So there are gives and takes on every decision that we make and that our neighbors make in other communities. Last Friday, the CDC published its updated guidelines for in-person instruction. They said there are 5 essential elements to follow in order to be able to open safely. 1, universal and correct use of masks, which we know we've been doing all year long. Maintaining at least 6 feet distancing indoors and outdoors, which we know our plans allow us to do. hand washing and respiratory etiquette built into the schedule, which we have at all of our schools, cleaning and maintaining healthy facilities, which we do a great job with, and contact tracing in coordination with isolation and quarantine and our health department, which we also have in place. So we're very happy to see that the new CDC guidelines fully reflect the efforts that have been in place in Warren since last summer when we reopened schools in September. The CDC also published this new chart of a new color coding system that is not the same as the state of New Jersey's, that has 4 levels: low to high, blue to red. As of the data this morning, Somerset County on the federal system is in high transmission red, which means that elementary school should be in hybrid mode according to this, with physical distancing of 6 feet or more required, and that middle and high school should be virtual only unless you can strictly implement mitigation strategies. We should be extraordinarily proud that even in this level of the new CDC guidelines, we are keeping our buildings open and operating. That's a credit to our staff, our students, and our parents. It's only if you get all the way down to very low transmission that they start talking about perhaps being a little bit more flexible with the 6 feet distancing and some other things about extracurricular activities. So as I said, there's lots of limitations on the actions we can take. And I know one of the common questions in the community is, but how come other places can do different things? Well, there's really, in my analysis, I found 2 explanations. One is they have a lower percentage of students in person. So we know from that chart earlier that Warren has more kids coming to school every day than everybody else. So if you only have 50% of your students, for example, you can bring them back more because there's more space available to you. Or they're simply not following the New Jersey Department of Health and CDC guidelines. Most commonly, that's on physical distancing. In some cases, that's also on bus capacity limits. In our county, in Somerset County, we did, there are about 2/3 of the districts have their kindergarten students in 5 days a week as of last week, including us. About 1/3 of the districts have their 1st and 2nd grade students in 5 days a week, including us. And just a couple of districts have 3 and above. We're proposing grade 3 tonight, and we're ready to propose grades 4 and 5 in the future, depending on the survey results. So we dug into those districts that are doing more than us a little bit. Only 2 districts in the county as of last week that have grades 3 or above in person, 5 days a week. District A has 1 school with about 800 students. District B has 1 school with about 325 students, compared to our 4 schools and about 1,000 students. You can see the percentage of in-person versus distance that are different from school to school. In District A, those students go to school for 2 hours in person each day. They go in the morning, then they clear, buildings are cleaned, then another group comes in and they flip-flop who's online and who's that person. So they're still doing a hybrid. It's just they come to school for part of every single day. It adds up to about 20 hours every 10 days, which they've had in place since the beginning of the school year. District B just implemented their plan for K4 only last week. Those students go to school in person for 4 hours and 20 minutes a day, which adds up to 42 hours every 10 days. Prior to this change last week, those students were going to school about 17.5 hours every 10 days. This new model in place, as I said, just last week, only through grade 4. What do we have in Warren? Currently, our students in 3 and above go to school 5 days out of every 10 for 4.5 hours. So it's 22.5 hours per 10 days, about 5 hours more every 10 days than District B, and about 2.5 hours more than District A, even though District A students go to school in person every day. Our future model for grades 3, 4, and 5, and our current model for grades K1 and 2 have students in person 4.5 hours every day, which is 45 hours every 10 days, by far the most number of in-school minutes of any elementary school in Somerset County. We anticipate this being ready for grade 3 on March 1st, and shortly thereafter for grades 4 and 5. The other thing that we've been able to do in Warren, as we've slowly and methodically ramped up at the elementary level, is dedicate teachers to full distance so that other teachers are dedicated to in-person. Not only does that allow us to accommodate some staff needs, but it also brings the burden on the teachers down significantly, so they're not trying to manage both in-person and at-home students, which is one of the biggest challenges to classroom community and effectiveness. Some other points of pride from the most recent stakeholder surveys, just to point out here. The majority of our students and staff members feel safe at school. I don't think we should take this for granted. We didn't know coming back how this was going to work. Our staff and our students tell us that they feel safe, which is really important. The majority of our students, parents, and staff members are satisfied with our return to school processes. You can see the range on the screen here, but people are satisfied that we are responding to health and wellness appropriately, we are building classroom and school community appropriately, and our instructional approaches are strong as well. And the majority of our parents and our staff members agree that we should adhere to state and federal guidelines for safely reopening schools. Most notably for our planning purposes is this first one here about 6 feet separation between students. 86% of staff, 71% of parents, clear majorities agree that we need to maintain physical distancing in our school facilities, which is a huge limiter on options for how we move forward. I also want to highlight a couple areas of focus that you'll hear more about that we are working on. Our middle school parents of in-school cohort A, B, and C students rate instructional approaches lower than our other groups at an average score of 2.8, which puts it almost right in the middle. That's our lowest across the district. Our middle school parents of both cohorts rate the connection between students when they're at home and in school lower than our elementary school parents and our staff and students do. And finally, and maybe most notably for future planning, our parents and our staff members clearly disagree on the importance of single session days as a health and safety measure, with 87% of staff thinking that it's important and only 37% of parents thinking it's important. And that brings us to our recommendations for March 1st. So you might remember hybrid 1.2 had a goal of transitioning our younger students and then our special education, higher need special education students to school 5 days per week. Back in the fall, in November, we were able to bring back preschool and our upper elementary special education students, and we were on a track to bring back grade 3 and middle school self-contained special education. Why did we start here? One, the current conditions and our protocols allowed us to bring some students back, and we didn't want to wait until we could bring all students back. We also know that accessing distance learning independently is more challenging for younger students and for students with certain special education needs. Not all special education needs, but certain special education needs. And the CDC advised in September and re-advised last week that younger children are less likely to have serious cases of COVID-19. Additionally, the most recent CDC guidelines encourage us to prioritize elementary school and special education, and specifically discourage mixing cohorts for entire middle school and high school populations. For grade 3, these slides are based on surveys we did back in the fall. We will resurvey and re-register families this week based on these recommendations. Hybrid grade 3 students will transition to in-person instruction 5 days per week with a dedicated homeroom teacher, and full-time distance learning students will be assigned a dedicated full-time distance learning teacher. So what is that? That looks like the same process as our K2 followed back in October. Those students who are coming in person will be assigned a homeroom with a single teacher. Most of those students will have a teacher who's already part of their instructional team. There may be some exceptions depending on how the numbers fall. We do expect to have an average class size in 3rd grade of 12, which is phenomenal, which is well underneath our district guidelines of a cap of 22, and that will allow us to keep 6-foot distancing in all of our 3rd grade classrooms. Our full-time distance 3rd graders will be assigned to one district-wide homeroom. This will mean that many of these students will have a new teacher. We will have one teacher for every 14 students, same ratio as we have in our in-person classes. And we will adjust the timing for the full distance students to match the later school times. So for ALT 3rd graders, this will mean a slightly later school day when the adjustment goes into effect. Just to show that in a visual, in a typical school year in a regular operation, we might have 2 classrooms with 18 students in each of them for a total of 36. When we reopened in September, we added a 3rd teacher who kind of supported the overall operations of those 2 teachers. So we have maybe 8 students in cohort A, 8 students in cohort B, and 2 students who are always at home. In hybrid 1.2, the change is that the cohort D students all get grouped together with a new teacher, and these 3 teachers split the in-class students so we have smaller class sizes. The other half of this recommendation is middle school self-contained special education. We did begin by looking at students who received either math or English language arts support, but due to the responses from parents, we were able to expand that to include both groups. It's a total of somewhere around 54 eligible families. Unlike elementary school special education and grades K through 3 general education, middle school students see multiple teachers and they move in and out of multiple classrooms each day. Even if they're in special education classes, they go into integrated science and social studies, for example. In order to return these students to school 5 days a week, they will need to mix with their peers in both cohort A and cohort B. So there will be some students who come to school Monday, Tuesday, others come to school Thursday, Friday, and now we're bringing a group that will be in with them both days following the same schedule. There's no other changes to the student schedules or the overall school operations, but this does introduce a limited amount of cohort mixing which the state allows under level yellow or green, which is why we held it for this week. Interestingly, when we surveyed the 54 or so families who are eligible to make this change, only 59% of them said they wanted their students to come back 5 days a week. That was an interesting data point for us, as we want to be careful that we don't force people into a situation that they're not ready for. So we did find a third of the families wanted their students to keep coming to school, but only in the hybrid model. 7% didn't respond. So something a little bit different with our middle school than with the elementary school plan. The students who are in this group, if their families opt into it, will come back to school 5 days per week beginning March 1st. But if they don't opt into it, they can stay in their current hybrid A or hybrid B. Full-time distance learning students will have no change to their model. They'll continue just as they are right now. So again, identified students will move to cohort C. They'll stay in the same classes with the same peers and the same teachers. And those classes will be limited to the number of students that we can safely fit with physical distancing in place. And no change whatsoever for our distance students, with the caveat that future changes may be limited if the classrooms are close to maximum capacity. Implementation calendar, assuming that this is approved at tonight's board meeting, we will submit the plan to the Department of Education tomorrow and begin surveying our parents. We're hoping that we'll get all those surveys back on Thursday so that on Friday we can analyze the survey results and figure out exactly where we need to make section breaks and other decisions, which will take us through next week as we finalize staffing, transportation, master schedule changes, bus routes, and make sure everybody's aware of any changes to arrival and dismissal with more cars coming into the parking lots so that students can return on Monday, March 1st. There are multiple surveys that will go live tomorrow. If you are a parent of a grade K1 or 2 student, you will get a survey about transportation. We need more families to voluntarily drive their children to school in order for us to potentially bring back 4th and 5th grade down the road. So all elementary school students will get the transportation survey at all grade levels so that we can try to free up some more space on the buses. Grade 3 students, families will also get a question about which model are they selecting, full in-person 5 days a week or full distance. And our 4th and 5th grade parents will also get a question about, do they want us to move forward with a plan for 5 days a week so that we can make sure that we're following the preferences there, because there are some drawbacks, as I've mentioned throughout this presentation. Our parents in our identified special education programs in the middle school will also get a survey about whether they are selecting to move into cohort C on March 1st. And I would be remiss if I didn't conclude by saying thank you to the many people, not only those that took the surveys, but all of the subcommittees, the Board of Education, everybody who's worked on answering many, many questions to make sure that we were ready to make these recommendations, from classroom spaces to cleaning protocols to making sure the technology of new learning spaces is ready to go, bus routes, and everything in between. So thank you everybody for your hard work and dedication. This is not easy, and we are working as quickly and safely as we can. And I'm happy to bring these recommendations to the board for consideration tonight. Thank you.